Welcome to Part 8. We've been talking about the Apostle Paul, the Apostle of the Gentiles. Jesus Christ gave commandments, and he revealed mysteries unto Paul for Paul to relay unto Gentiles in the age of grace. Paul was the ambassador of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, traveling to where they were and giving them the information that they needed in the age of grace. What Paul did not communicate through spoken word, he communicated through his epistles. Paul, through his apostleship of the Gentiles, had the honor of being greatly used by Jesus Christ. So Paul had a pretty cool life, right? Well, not exactly. Remember back when Paul was still Saul and he was persecuting Christians? That was when Jesus Christ spoke to him and left him blind. Jesus spoke to Ananias, who was in the city of Damascus, telling him to go and put his hands on Paul so that Paul would regain his vision. When speaking to Ananias, Jesus Christ said the following concerning Paul in Acts chapter 9, verse 16. "For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake." It was Paul's destiny to suffer greatly for the cause of Christ. Paul mentioned things that he suffered in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Verse 23, "In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft." When Paul mentioned stripes, he was referring to having been whipped. Verse 24, "Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one." Verse 25, "Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, a night and a day I have been in the deep." Verse 26, "In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren." Verse 27, "In weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness." Verse 28, "Beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches." Paul suffered many things, and he continued on despite this suffering, taking on himself the care of all of the Gentile churches that he helped to establish. Paul was locked up in prisons. Paul was beaten. Paul was whipped. Paul was stoned. But Paul continued on. Now, what was another way that Paul suffered? Remember how Paul received revelations from Jesus Christ? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, Paul wrote the following, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." Paul was given many revelations by Jesus Christ. This could have gone to his head and caused him to become puffed up and arrogant. To keep this from happening, Paul was given an unspecified handicap or ailment. I believe that poor vision was the issue because of a statement that Paul made in Galatians chapter 4, verse 15. Whatever it was exactly, Paul prayed that it would be taken away from him. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10. "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." In order to keep him humble, Paul was given a thorn in the flesh, an infirmity. Jesus Christ would not heal Paul of this infirmity, telling him instead, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." Paul learned to accept and take pleasure in his infirmities, because through his infirmities, the power of Christ rested upon him. This is why Paul said, "When I am weak, then am I strong." Paul wrote in Galatians 4, verse 13, "Ye know how through infirmity of the flesh I preached the gospel unto you at the first." Paul did not let his infirmities stop him, but instead he took pleasure in them. In the following verses, the word glory means boast. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 30, "If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities." 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 5, Of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities. Not only did Paul take pleasure in his infirmities, he said that if he must boast of himself, then he would boast of his infirmities. Paul could not and would not boast of his own greatness. He would boast of his weakness because it was through his weakness that the power of Christ rested upon him and made him strong. So Paul suffered such things as imprisonments, beatings, and being stoned. And Paul suffered from an infirmity that made him weak in the flesh. What was another way that Paul suffered? In Philippians 3, verses 5 through 8, Paul wrote the following concerning himself. Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. But what things were gain to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. Paul was a Jew, and he had been proud of his heritage, circumcised the 8th day according to the tradition of the law of Moses, an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee with so much zeal for the law that he had been persecuting Christians. When it came to the righteousness of the law, Paul was blameless, meaning that he had perfectly obeyed the law his entire life. The Jews were God's chosen people through their obedience to the law of Moses, the first covenant. Paul thought that he was really rocking it out. He thought that if anybody was in good standing with God, it was him. With his background of being a Jew and a Pharisee, with perfect obedience to the law, and such passionate devotion to the law that he was persecuting Christians who were seen as the enemy of the law, Paul had great confidence in who he was and what he had achieved. Remember how Paul had studied under Gamaliel, that doctor of the law who was held in reputation among all the people? Remember how Paul was on fire for the law? Paul was surely a hero to the Jews, a role model for Jewish boys and young men. Jewish moms and dads wanted their young sons to grow up and be just like Paul. But what happened to all of that admiration and respect after Paul's conversion to Christianity? For the Jews who did not believe on Jesus as their Messiah, they lost their high regard for Paul. In their eyes, their hero had fallen. Paul was no longer their golden boy. He was a traitor. When the Jews saw Paul in the street, they no longer cheered for him. They were disgusted at the sight of him. Wherever Paul was found preaching the gospel, unbelieving Jews would try to sabotage his efforts. Acts 13, verse 45. But when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy, and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. Acts 14, verse 2. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles, and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. The Jews were spreading the word. They were broadcasting the news that Paul was teaching contrary to the law of Moses, and that he was associating with Gentiles. Acts 21, verses 27 through 28. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people, and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, and the law, and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. The Jews were just making assumptions at this point, assuming that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. Verse 29, For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. The unbelieving Jews were sabotaging, they were contradicting and blaspheming, they were accusing and making assumptions, and some of the unbelieving Jews even wanted Paul dead. Acts 9, verse 23, And after that many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him. Acts 23, verse 12, And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Everything changed for Paul. He lost it all. His own people hated him. He rejected his religious education. His beliefs were shattered. Paul truly had suffered the loss of all things for Jesus Christ. So how did Paul handle this? What was his outlook? Philippians 3:9, I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ. Paul did not hold back here. He stated what he now thought of all that he previously had, and it was not pretty. He considered it waste. He considered it excrement. Paul went on to write the following in Philippians 3, verses 13 through 14. But this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before. I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Paul basically said, I suffered the loss of all things, but I am forgetting those things that I left behind. I'm going forward. I'm pressing on. I'm running towards the goal. I'm racing for the prize. To Paul, a Christian's time on this earth was like a race. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 24. Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run that ye may obtain. Hebrews 12, verse 2. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Paul saw himself as being in a race, which is why he wrote that he was pressing toward the mark for the prize. To the unbelieving Jews, Paul looked like a big failure. He lost everything, and he suffered and suffered for over 30 years. Paul's final epistle before he died was the book of 2 Timothy. Listen to what Paul wrote just before he died. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. Paul had finished his course, and a crown of righteousness was waiting for him. He completed his race. He won the prize. But that prize did not come easy. Remember when Jesus Christ said concerning Paul, I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake? Jesus was not kidding around, was he? Before his crucifixion, Jesus told his disciples that he would suffer. Mark 8, verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things. Jesus told his disciples the following concerning himself. Luke 17, verse 25. But first must he suffer many things, and be rejected of this generation. Jesus foretold his suffering to his disciples, just as he foretold Paul's suffering to Ananias. Paul truly did suffer great things for Jesus. Maybe that's why Paul wrote the following in Philippians 3, verse 10, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. Paul greatly suffered as the apostle of the Gentiles. Don't let it all have been in vain. If you are a Gentile and you believe on Jesus Christ, then recognize that Paul was your apostle. Study his teachings and learn what he taught. Paul was a chosen vessel unto Jesus Christ. Paul delivered the commandments and the mysteries from Jesus Christ for Gentiles in the age of grace. And Paul suffered greatly for what he did. I'm going to end this video here, and I invite you to check out part 9. It's time to conclude this lesson. Maybe we will do it in one video, maybe it will take 2. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. Check out part 9, and as always, thanks for listening.